Caroline is 46. She holds a doctoral degree in applied statistics and has spent 2 decades working in quantitative risk analysis for a consultancy that advises infrastructure investment funds. She is, by professional formation and personal temperament, someone for whom the word meaningful applied to a coincidence registers as a category error. Coincidences are not meaningful. They are the visible subset of a much larger population of unremarkable random events, the ones that get noticed and remembered precisely because they appear non-random. She knows this. She teaches versions of it. 3 months ago, on a Thursday in February, her morning flight to Edinburgh was cancelled due to a technical fault. She was rerouted via Manchester and found herself seated beside a woman who worked in medical device regulation, a field Caroline had abandoned after her first degree, before the statistics career, before she had stopped thinking of herself as someone interested in the relationship between engineering and human safety. They spoke for the duration of the flight. The conversation was substantive. 2 days later, still in Edinburgh, Caroline left a dinner early because she was tired and found herself in a bookshop that was preparing to close. On the table near the door was a book she had never heard of, by an author she had never read, on a subject that was the direct continuation of the conversation from the flight. She bought it. The following week, back in London, a former colleague she had not spoken to in 6 years sent her an unsolicited message asking whether she had ever considered moving into the emerging field of algorithmic risk in medical technology. 3 weeks later, Caroline had resigned her position. She has spent the subsequent months in a state she describes as disturbed clarity, a feeling that what happened was significant in a way she cannot account for inside her existing framework, and that her inability to account for it is itself disturbing. This is not superstition. This is something that Jung spent years trying to formulate with intellectual honesty and never quite finished. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The case presented is entirely fictional, constructed to illustrate a psychological concept. Synchronicity is one of the most misused words in popular psychology, and the misuse is significant because it obscures precisely what makes Jung's actual formulation interesting. The popular version of synchronicity is essentially a mystical claim. The universe sends signs. Meaningful coincidences are guidance. When things align, it means something cosmic is operating. This is not Jung's position, and the gap between the popular version and Jung's actual position is the most intellectually honest place to examine the concept. Jung introduced the term synchronicity in his 1952 essay, published in the Collected Works as Volume 8, in a section titled Synchronicity, an Acausal connecting principle. The essay itself is unusual in Jung's corpus, technical, hedged, genuinely uncertain in tone. Jung was attempting to account for a class of psychological phenomena he had observed in clinical practice and could not explain within the standard causal framework of natural science, but which he also refused to assign to the supernatural. The phenomena in question were what might be called meaningful coincidences, instances in which an outer event and an inner psychological state, a thought, an image, a dream, aligned in a way that carried genuine subjective significance without any causal connection between them being traceable. No mechanism linked the inner and outer events. And yet the correspondence was real, and its effect on the person experiencing it was real, and sometimes. This was the clinical observation Jung kept returning to. The effect was genuinely transformative. Jung's formulation, carefully stated, was this: synchronicity refers to the meaningful coincidence of two events that are not causally connected, but that share an equivalent meaning. The operative word is meaning. Synchronicity, for Jung, is not a metaphysical claim about the structure of the universe. It is a psychological observation about the role of meaning in human experience. The fact that the psyche has its own principle of connection, which is not causality, but significance. In CW8, Jung described synchronicity as a form of coincidence that carries the characteristic quality of numinosity, the felt sense of something extraordinary, of significance exceeding the event's apparent content. This numinous quality is the indicator, in his clinical framework, that the unconscious is involved. The synchronistic experience is not simply an unexpected coincidence. It is an unexpected coincidence that the deeper layers of the psyche respond to with an intensity that the surface event does not fully explain. To understand why Jung found it necessary to propose synchronicity as a concept, why he risked the professional credibility of his later years on an idea that his scientific contemporaries found at best speculative and at worst mystical, it helps to understand what clinical problem it was designed to solve. The problem was this. In decades of clinical work, Jung had repeatedly encountered instances in which the unconscious seemed to have access to information that the patient's conscious mind did not have, and that the information appeared not just in dreams or fantasies, but in the arrangement of outer events in ways that corresponded precisely to the patient's inner psychological situation. The most famous example he cited was the golden scarab. A patient was recounting a dream about a golden scarab when, at that moment, Jung heard a tapping at the window, a scarab beetle attempting to enter the room. The beetle was, in that geographical region, highly unusual. The timing was exact. Jung was not claiming that the beetle caused the dream, or that the dream summoned the beetle. He was claiming something more modest and, in some ways, more radical, that the category of causality, the standard scientific framework for connecting events, was not the only framework available for understanding meaningful connection, that there existed a class of connections organized around meaning rather than cause, and that these connections were psychologically real regardless of whether they had metaphysical reality. This distinction is the center of the concept, and it is what separates Jung's position from both simple mysticism and simple skepticism. The simple mystical position says, meaningful coincidences are signs from a conscious universe. The simple skeptical position says, meaningful coincidences are statistical inevitabilities that our pattern recognition systems overinterpret. Jung's position says, both of those responses miss what is psychologically significant. The fact that certain coincidences produce a genuine experience of meaning that restructures a person's relationship to their life, and that this psychological reality demands accounting for regardless of its metaphysical status. He found an unexpected intellectual partner in this project. Wolfgang Pauli, one of the foundational figures of quantum physics, Nobel laureate, architect of the exclusion principle, entered into an extended correspondence and collaboration with Jung around the question of synchronicity. Pauli was drawn to the problem from the physics side. Quantum mechanics had already demonstrated that the classical assumption of strict causal determinism was incomplete at the level of particle physics, that the observer's participation was implicated in the observed event in ways that classical science had not anticipated. Pauli and Jung explored the possibility that synchronicity represented, at the psychological level, a phenomenon analogous to quantum non-locality, connection without causal mediation. This collaboration produced the jointly published volume The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche in 1955. Jung never resolved the metaphysical question and was, to his credit, honest about this. In CW8, he described synchronicity as a concept that stands on the threshold between psychology and physics, in a territory neither discipline had adequately mapped. The willingness to name the threshold rather than pretend it was not there is one of the more intellectually honest gestures in his late work. Marie-Louise von Franz extended the synchronicity concept in her work Number and Time, examining the relationship between synchronistic experiences and numerical symbolism across cultures, suggesting that the ordering principle behind synchronicity might be related to what she called the unus mundus, the hypothetical unified ground underlying both psyche and matter. This is highly speculative territory, and von Franz acknowledged it as such. But the speculation is honest speculation, conducted by someone who had spent decades in the clinical and philosophical trenches of the problem. What the synchronicity concept ultimately asks of the rationalist, Caroline, in our case, is not that she abandon her statistical framework. It asks something more precise, whether her statistical framework is adequate to account for the totality of her experience, specifically the experience of meaning. The statistical perspective can explain that a canceled flight, an overheard conversation, a found book, and an unsolicited message each have calculable individual probabilities and that their coincidence, while notable, is within the range of random occurrence. What it cannot explain is why those particular events, in that particular sequence, at that particular moment in Caroline's life, produced a response in her that no other combination of comparable events in the previous 20 years had produced. The meaning is not in the statistics. The meaning is in the subjective weight the events carry. And that weight is a psychological reality whether or not it has a metaphysical cause. Return to Caroline. She has described her state in the weeks following the three events as disturbed clarity. Both words deserve attention. The clarity is not in question. Something in her experience of those three events produced a shift in her orientation, a sudden legibility of a direction that had been present but unrecognized, or perhaps suppressed, for years. The previous career in medical device regulation that she left before the statistics doctorate was not left because it failed to interest her. It was left, she remembers now, because it felt impractical, because the statistics path was more clearly funded, more professionally tractable, more consistent with what she thought a rigorous career should look like. The interest did not go with it. The interest went underground. The three events in February did not create the clarity. They released it. The canceled flight, the woman on the plane, the book, the message, these did not introduce new information into Caroline's life in any strict sense. They returned to visibility something that had been invisible for 20 years. The Jungian reading of this is not that the events were arranged by a caring universe for Caroline's benefit. It is that the psyche, which had been carrying the suppressed interest for 2 decades, was sufficiently attuned to anything in the outer world that corresponded to what it was holding, that the correspondence, when it finally appeared with sufficient density, produced the experience of recognition, the felt sense that something important was happening. The disturbance is equally real. Caroline's statistical framework cannot accommodate this account without losing something it regards as essential, the commitment to the independence of events from meaning. Her professional identity is organized around the principle that meaning is not a property of events, but of the minds that interpret them. Synchronicity, as an experience, insists otherwise, or at least insists that the interpreter's contribution is more constitutive of the event's significance than the framework allows. This is, in Jungian terms, a precisely calibrated challenge. The disturbed clarity Caroline is experiencing is the specific form that the encounter between a dominant rational attitude and a synchronistic event tends to take in an intellectually rigorous person. She cannot dismiss the experience. It was too precise, its effect on her life too substantial. She cannot absorb it into her existing framework. It does not fit. She is left holding two things that her framework says cannot both be true, and that her experience says are both real. Jung would not have asked her to resolve this contradiction. He would have asked her to bear it. The capacity to hold the tension between the rational framework and the synchronistic experience, not collapsing into either naive mysticism on one side or defensive dismissal on the other, is, in his formulation, itself a developmental achievement. The meaning that the events carried is real as a psychological event. Whether it was produced by a causal mechanism, by the unconscious's selective attention to relevant outer events, or by something in the structure of reality that neither psychology nor physics has yet adequately described, that question remains open. Remaining genuinely open to it, without demanding a premature answer, is the intellectual integrity the concept requires. One might ask, not in the spirit of mystical affirmation but of genuine curiosity, whether there has been a moment in one's own experience when the outer world seemed to organize itself in correspondence with an interior state, and whether that moment was simply dismissed, or whether something in the dismissal felt slightly dishonest. Not dishonest in the sense of knowing it was significant and pretending otherwise, but dishonest in the sense of applying a framework with more confidence than the experience warranted. One might also consider whether any significant turn in one's own life, any departure from the direction that logic and planning would have prescribed, was accompanied by a quality that resembled what Caroline describes, the sense that events were clustering in a way that exceeded pure coincidence. Not the claim that they did exceed it, but the experience of a weight that the rational account leaves unexplained. The broader cultural observation is this: The intellectual frameworks available to educated professionals in the contemporary West are organized, almost without exception, around causality as the primary explanatory principle. This is appropriate for the domains where causality applies reliably. It becomes a liability in the domain of meaning, specifically in the experience of significant coincidence, of events that cluster around pivotal moments in a way that feels organized without there being any apparent organizer. Jung's contribution to this problem is not a metaphysical answer. It is a conceptual permission, the permission to take seriously, as a psychological datum, the experience of meaningful coincidence, without being forced to choose between the mystical explanation and the dismissive one. The experience is real. Its cause remains uncertain. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the concept. It is the intellectual position the evidence actually supports. What synchronicity points to, at minimum, is the depth of the relationship between inner and outer experience, the degree to which the psyche does not simply receive a neutral outer world, but actively participates in what it notices, what it responds to, and what it allows to carry weight. Whether that participation is purely psychological or whether it implicates something in the structure of reality beyond the individual mind remains, as Jung himself acknowledged, an open question he was not able to close. Caroline's disturbed clarity is an honest account of the experience of encountering a phenomenon that exceeds one's existing framework without invalidating it. The statistical frame is not wrong. The events in February were individually improbable and collectively more improbable. What the statistics cannot reach is the 20 years of suppressed interest that those events activated and the transformation of a life direction that followed. Jung spent decades trying to give that remainder a rigorous name. Synchronicity is imperfect. It is also the most honest attempt available. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The Shadow Work PDF, 5 Questions to Begin, is available through the link in the description. Subscribe if this kind of inquiry resonates with something you have encountered. The next concepts in this series reach further into the territory Jung mapped at the edges of what psychology could claim to know.